Okay, let's talk a little bit in this video, welcome by the way, about where one of the most specific applications of active transport occurs. So let's start by drawing a very large cell here, and then we'll draw something else within it. So I'm not going to draw like this. There's a big cell, and so out here we have then glucose, and we have glycolysis, which results in pyruvate, right? And then pyruvate gets turned into acetyl coenzyme A, right? We lose a carbon dioxide. And then all of this enters into the, this part is actually occurring just as it's being transported into the mitochondria. And the acetyl coenzyme A then enters into the citric acid cycle. It reacts with oxaloacetate, right? It generates a couple more NADHs, right? It also produces an ATP and then another NADH. It actually produces an FADH2 as well, but I'm not going to go into that as much. Okay, so then all of these NADHs produces, and then these NADHs go up and they go to the inner membrane of the mitochondria. This stuff in the middle is called the matrix, and then we have what we call the intermembrane space, and this whole thing is then called the mitochondria. So now let's look at what is happening up here on this inner membrane here. Let's take this picture and we'll take it to the next slide. Okay, so now we're only going to look at this, and we're not going to talk anything about the glycolysis business or the citric acid cycle. We're just going to look at NADH and its role in the electron transport chain. So now let's look at this. Let's draw two membranes here. So here's our membrane. Here's our outer membrane. It is, of course, made up of lipids and a lipid bilayer, like so. So it's a normal membrane. And so this is the outer membrane of the mitochondria. I'm going to draw this membrane down here very much fatter, but it's actually not bigger. It's actually, I think it might even be thinner if I'm not mistaken. But they're basically the same shape. But I'm going to draw then I'm going to draw some proteins here. So let's draw the lipids first. Sorry, let's draw the lipids. And let's remind ourselves that this is actually a membrane, and then we'll draw a protein here. Okay? So there's our first protein. This protein is a transporter protein that is involved in active transport. So let's look at that. What happens is that the NADH that is produced in the citric acid cycle releases 2 electrons here. Those 2 electrons then are responsible then, and then let's be really clear. Let's be really clear that when an electron is given away, it's given away to something, right? So this is losing electrons, so it's being oxidized. This protein is being reduced, but ultimately there's at the end of this, there's an ultimate oxidizing agent at the end that is going to be trying to gain these electrons. And so we have to keep in mind that this is only one step in a much longer, more complicated situation. So what's happening now is that you have a protein here that now allows, because of these electrons, pumps H plus ions through the membrane from this side. So it pumps it through. So this protein here, which has, it's got a special name and everything like that, but I'm not worried about that. This protein is then a protein. This is a proton pump. So we're talking about active transport. Right? It's moving something against the gradient. The electrons then move along, and they actually get captured by another protein inside of the membrane here that is responsible for transferring it over to the next major pump. So these electrons kind of go over like this, and when they do that, they get moved over to the next proton pump. And this proton pump does exactly as the first one does. It takes hydrogen ions, protons, and pumps it through the membrane. So, and now this proton is also up in this intermembrane space between the two membranes of the mitochondria. So here you have some examples of some proteins that are intermembrane and transmembrane proteins. This electron then, ultimately then, these electrons get transferred, and they get transferred down, and then they ultimately end up in yet another transmembrane protein. They all have 3 different names, and you can learn them if you like. But for now, we're just going to do this, right? And so these are all stuck in the membrane of the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And then these electrons go here, and they still have quite a bit of energy. I mean, they all have the same amount of energy. And this one pumps an additional hydrogen proton through the membrane. And so now you have how many? You have, for one NADH, you have pumped 3 hydrogen ions across the membrane, and you have created then a proton gradient, or hydrogen ion concentration gradient. So you have a high concentration of H plus here, and relatively speaking, a low concentration of H plus here. The energy required to do this is coming from NADH, but to be quite clear, it's not only coming from NADH, it's also coming from the fact that at the other end of this process is waiting oxygen. So NADH is pushing, but oxygen is pulling this electron, or these electrons, through this system. You can't have one without the other. You have to have something that pushes and something that pulls if you're going to have an energy gradient, right? An electron doesn't travel, like, oh, here's an electron. It has to be traveling from something that is, right, giving away electrons to something that really wants electrons. So here you have the NADH, which is obviously oxidizing, so it's a reducing agent, and it's at the other end you have this oxidizing agent, the best one of them all, the one that gives it the name, oxygen. So the reaction becomes then, at the other end of this, O2, and you can do it with 2, if you want to, you can do it with actual oxygen. So then you have to have like plus 4 electrons. So this has to happen a couple times, right? 4 electrons makes 2 O2 minus. So you are taking oxygen and you're making oxide ions. Those 2 oxide ions, in turn, react with 2 hydrogen plus to make water, which is the other product of respiration. You have oxygen, you breathe oxygen, you produce water, and you produce carbon dioxide. But the carbon dioxide comes from the citric acid cycle. Now, what happens with these hydrogens? Well, these hydrogens ultimately, they end up in what we call ATP synthetase, which is then a protein over here, and we'll draw it over here. Looks like this. It's got a round bottom, and we've got the lipid bilayer continues over here, right, all the way up to this other enzyme. And this other enzyme then allows the hydrogens to flow back through. And when they flow back through, they're obviously flowing from a high concentration to a low concentration. So this is diffusion, right, which is passive transport, back through the membrane. And as they do so, they generate, they take ADP and they generate ATP plus P, right? So you have this ATP synthetase. ATP synthetase or synthase. It depends on, this is the old name, I think. I actually think this is the old name. I think it's actually called synthase now. ATP synthase. So forget that synthetase. That was what I learned, but now it's actually been changed name to ATP synthase. I think it sounds better with synthase too. So here you have it then. The NADH is the energy required to do the active transportation of hydrogen ions against the gradient, because you have a higher gradient, have a higher concentration in here, so it needs to push it through. It pushes through 3, and then the hydrogen concentration builds up in this small space between the two membranes, so there's a really high concentration of H+, which then creates a certain amount of potential, and that potential can be realized as diffusion through this ATP synthetase, which is a kind of a special channel because it allows the diffusion of H+. But through that diffusion, through this particular type of channel, you can harvest the energy of the protons moving through to generate ATP. This enzyme is present in both respiration, right, which is then, this is the electron transportation chain, ETC. This enzyme is also present in photosynthesis, obviously, in the electron transport chain, This process is sometimes called oxidative phosphorylation. That's a fancy name for this whole process, which is just the electron transport chain of the respiration cycle. So NADH from both glycolysis and from the citric acid cycle then cause the movement of H pluses across the membrane, and due to the electrical potential between NADH and O2, the energy is harvested, and you can then gather all that energy in the form of a proton gradient between the two, and then you can make ATP. Thank you very much.